of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
Tonight, a presidential fire hose of information.
First, they pay. And everybody pays. Everybody has to pay. And the incentive is that they have the right to deal in the United States. We're probably 2 days off from sending them a letter. We are talking to them. I just want you to know, a letter means a deal. Today we're doing copper.
Copper, what would that tariff be on? The sectional tariff?
I believe the tariff on copper, we're going to make it 50%.
President Trump issuing fresh tariff threats, including that 50% levy on copper, fresh criticism for the Fed chair, and more during a lengthy cabinet meeting. We'll have reaction from former U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills.
Plus, is a ceasefire deal in Gaza on the horizon?
We are hopeful that by the end of this week, we will have an agreement that will bring us into a 60-day ceasefire. 10 live hostages will be released.
Just a day after dining with the president, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continuing his charm offensive in D.C., meeting with officials in Washington, returning to the White House as well for a second consecutive day as the administration pushes for that ceasefire deal.
And the search and rescue effort continues in Texas Hill Country.
The primary job right now continues to be locating everybody who was affected by this flood. There still remain those who are missing. We have to find every single person who's missing.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott holding a press conference tonight in Kerr County after visiting the flood-torn area where over 100 people were killed, with more than 160 still missing. The questions now being asked in the wake of tragedy.
We begin our coverage tonight with the trade news coming out of the White House today following the president's marathon cabinet meeting. We brought you live here on Bloomberg, his first since the passage of his One Big Beautiful Bill last week. President now setting his sights on those much-promised trade deals, with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick saying we can expect another 15 to 20 trade letters to be issued over the next 2 days, following those we saw yesterday addressed to the leaders of Japan, South Korea, Myanmar, and more.
Plus, the president announcing he'll impose a 50% tariff on copper. For more, we have Bloomberg's Dan Flatley here in Washington and Romaine Bostick joining us from World Headquarters in New York. But Dan, we'll begin with you, as obviously we knew copper tariffs were in the works. We just didn't know when they would come or what level they would be set at. Now it seems we do have some clarity.
Yes, well, we do. We have clarity for certain. We have this the statement from the president, 50% on copper, which was something we were not expecting when we sort of got up this morning and started thinking about what is coming next in terms of tariffs. We also got in the last 24 hours a little bit more clarity on what this August 1st deadline means. So, President Trump has spoken in recent days about these letters that will be going out to countries, giving them their tariff rate. Yeah. There's been a lot of speculation as to whether this means, is this just another negotiating tactic? In other words, is he kind of ramping up the pressure on these countries that, the administration has been saying in recent days have been close to deals but haven't quite gotten there? Or is this really the beginning of a new phase here? And what he said today was August 1st is the deadline, and that's not going to change. He has said things like that in the past. So, in a sense, we have gotten a little bit of clarity, but there's still many questions about how this will ultimately all play out.
Can we just clarify one thing, that this was at one point a July 9 deadline? That would be tomorrow. The markets were counting down to this moment. He said today it was always August 1st, even though he made that announcement and signed the executive order just yesterday.
Right.
This is new, correct?
Yes, this is new. This is a little unexpected, obviously. It's interesting going back a week or two. I covered the Treasury Department. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has talked in recent days about the potential for extending some of these deals or to kind of go back to his wording. I think the way that he phrased it was that some of these deals could come in September or in August or leading into the fall. So things are a little fluid. We know Trump likes his 2-week increments, 2-week deadlines. Sure. I think that a lot of folks, again, as I said before, are sort of viewing this as potentially just Trump kind of ramping up the pressure on some of these countries who haven't yet inked these deals. even the deals that have been sort of announced are a little bit tenuous. Basically, they're announcing that, we have an agreement to continue talking to kind of iron out some of the details with the UK agreement and things of that nature. So, and then let's not forget China is also kind of hanging out there in the background. And so we're expecting some movement on that, potentially another meeting between Bessent and his Chinese counterparts at some point in the next month or two, and also the deadline for that looming in August. So,
as usual, we have a lot to learn still. Bloomberg's Dan Flatley, thanks for making some sense out of this as we now look for how the markets reacted to these updates from the president. We turn to Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick joining us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine, how's the market making sense of this?
Well, I'm not sure they did. I mean, there was a lot of activity in the commodity space, largely off those headlines with regards to the president's comments about copper. In fact, we saw copper futures, the futures that trade here in New York on the COMEX, at one point spiked more than 10% on the day to a record high, $5.89 a pound. They settled back down just slightly below that here. But the idea right now is that this is a market that was really taken off guard by that 50% comment, Joe. Remember, the president had been musing for quite some time about imposing tariffs on copper. He had already started a 270-day review process back in February. But at the time, most people had assumed that that tariff would probably be at 25%. So the idea that he's musing about 50% caused a little bit of concern there. And you saw the big uptick in prices. And a big part of the reason for that is also this idea, Joe, that the market to a certain extent might actually be starting to believe that Trump's bite might actually be worse than his bark, the idea that he may actually follow through on this. Put up what pharmaceutical stocks did on this day, because he also mused about 200% tariffs on pharmaceutical drugs imported from overseas. And we did see a big reaction in those stocks. They did dip into the red briefly, but then they quickly rebounded when it became clear that any move on that front, Joe, was not going to be imminent, as Trump said at that cabinet meeting. It might be a year before we get to that on the pharmaceutical side.
Well, Romaine, as we consider tariffs and whether or not ultimately they materialize, what impact they will have on prices, it's also worth noting that the president reignited his criticism of the Fed Chair Jerome Powell, suggesting at one point he should resign if he did indeed lie to Congress. There was a time when any criticism of the Fed chair would also make markets shake in their boots, and yet it doesn't really seem like it has any effect any longer.
Well, I think there's two big things going on. One is that Jay Powell, one way or the other, is at the end of his tenure. It formally expires in May of next year. So there is a market that's already sort of transitioning or preparing for that transition to a new Fed chair, whether that's going to come earlier than expected or not. I think the market is at least prepared for it. Also, it's pretty clear, at least to the market, Kaylee, as to, well, let's just say the type of person that might fill Jay Powell's seat. Clearly, the president wants somebody that, in his view, is going to be a bit more dovish, and the market seems to be embracing that idea and not necessarily reacting in a negative way to some of the pressure that Trump is trying to exert on Jay Powell to step aside.
All right, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick in New York for us. Thank you so much. And we want to dig further into the developments we got on trade today as we turn to Carla Hills, a former U.S. trade representative during the George H.W. Bush administration. Ambassador, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. When we consider that the president suggested today that this is simply a clarification of what the trade deadline for various countries to make deals with the U.S. actually is, that it's August 1st, not tomorrow, as we had long been expecting, should countries take his threat to make August 1st the hard and fast deadline seriously? Or what incentive do they have to try to make a deal by then when it has been proven time and again that this is a moving target?
I think that they are very uncertain, just like you are and I am. And that is not good for either for our leadership or for our attracting new investment or the results that would come from the president achieving his objectives of imposing high tariffs. That would be devastating to our economy.
So we're looking at August 1st. Once again, how much can be accomplished in the next 21 days?
I don't know how serious he is about putting a tariff on, for example, Japan, which has one of the lowest tariffs in the world in our country and is our largest foreign investor. So there should be some incentive on his part to make a deal as fast as he can. And you can go through the list of the 14 that he has selected, the basic 12 plus. And, you know, he complains that he wants his allies to be on his side with respect to his complaints with respect to China. Well, he has hit his Asian friends and allies, South Korea and Japan, which doesn't bring them back to his desk with a smile.
Well, and Ambassador, when we consider countries like Japan and South Korea and the auto sector, for example, how do sectoral tariffs make all of this effort harder? That it's one thing to negotiate what the kind of top line tariff level is going to be across the board, but knowing that there are existing tariffs on things like autos or steel and aluminum, or today we learned about copper, how much more difficult does that make all of this effort?
Enormously more difficult. I think that when you upset the supply lines, it's extraordinarily expensive to try to recreate them. And we have really created a lot of uncertainty. In the George Herbert Walker Bush days, we were a leader for rules governing trade. And by opening up the markets, we created growth across the globe. Today, we seem to be doing exactly the opposite, and we're insulting our allies. We are pulling out of agreements so that we don't have uncertainty. And if the deal goes through that he has articulated, in fact, it'll raise inflation. It'll lower the number of jobs that we create. It will create more costly products that we can't participate in, and it's going to hurt the economy. So for geopolitical reasons and for economic reasons, his plan, and I'm not sure he has one, is most unfortunate.
Well, that's interesting that you suggest there may not be a plan, because some have thought that the president might be kind of skywriting or making this up as he goes here. What does this mean for long-term countries, trading partners with the U.S.? Are we pushing them into the hands of China?
Well, we're certainly not keeping our friends and allies with us on the areas of strategy that we want to follow. And I think uncertainty is devastating across the board. But you ask yourself, what is he trying to accomplish? He's trying to attract investment. He's not going to attract investment by putting tariffs on the supply chains that the investors need. Is he trying to get a leadership role? I think you're going to find people turning their backs on us, and that we will no longer be the leader of the global world. So what are his objectives? And is he taking steps that would advance the interests of the United States? My answer is absolutely not. It's tragic what he's doing to our economy.
Well, the president does contend, Ambassador, that part of his aim is to onshore more manufacturing to take place in the United States. He referenced that when he threatened perhaps 200% tariffs on pharmaceuticals, though he suggested that would be a year or more from now to allow companies the time to actually onshore. Is even a year-long time frame for that kind of supply chain shift realistic?
It's not. You can't really explain it. I mean, look. You're putting a 25% tax tariff on Japan, which is our largest inward investment. And it's absolutely, autos are one of the areas that we work with Japan on. Do they want to come here and not be able to get the aluminum, steel, widgets that they need for their construction? Absolutely not. This doesn't make any sense.
President Trump says that we've been getting ripped off for generations, Ambassador, that decades worth of ripping off the United States is going to take a little bit longer to even out trade relations. Does he have a point?
No. I think that for generations, the United States has been a leader in the global economy and geopolitically. And I think that the steps that we're taking today have damaging effects in both areas. And so I hope that his advisors persuade him that this is not a good plan. But to suggest tariffs, if he puts them on, it's going to hurt our economy enormously. And interestingly, when he hurts the economy, he hurts the lowest quintile most, because they're the ones that buy the imported clothes, cheap shoes, and those kinds of things. And so we are really taking a step, not only one, we're running back, and it's not attractive.
Well, we appreciate your insights, as always. Carla Hills, former U.S. Trade Representative in the George H.W. Bush administration, we thank you for being with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, we'll have more on the impact of tariffs in states like Michigan. Our conversation with Democratic Congresswoman and U.S. Senate candidate Haley Stevens ahead. But first, President Trump is meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu again at the White House. They're together right now. And we'll discuss the likelihood of a ceasefire deal coming up with Barbara Leaf, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
He's going to come over again tonight. We're going to be talking about, I would say, almost exclusively Gaza. We got to get that solved. Gaza is a tragedy. It's a tragedy. And he wants to get it solved, and I want to get it solved. And I think the other side wants to get it solved. We think we're going to have it solved pretty soon, hopefully with a real solution, a solution that's going to be holding up.
President Trump earlier today confirming that he will be hosting another meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which is underway now at the White House, part of the president's continued push to reach an agreement to end the war in Gaza. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff said today he expects a ceasefire deal by the end of the week. And joining us now for more on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, Barbara Leaf, former Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs under the Biden administration. She also served as ambassador to the UAE and is now Senior International Policy Advisor at Arnold and Porter. Ambassador, thank you for being here on Balance of Power. As we consider the real prospects of a ceasefire deal, knowing many have been put forward with one side having said they agreed and the other side never coming around, how optimistic are you that we can actually get one this time?
Well, Haley, I'd like to be optimistic. That's my normal bent, but I'm not terribly optimistic at this point. And the reason is simple. The fundamentals that have divided the sides for 19 months really haven't altered. The one new thing here is a change of administration, a president who has got significant leverage with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And now it's a question of whether we'll see that leverage exercised, I think.
Well, we heard, Ambassador, from Steve Witkoff today, President Trump's special envoy to the Middle East. Of course, he's involved in a lot of other issues, but he provided a timeline for what they see as a potential ceasefire in Gaza. This came from the cabinet meeting today at the White House. Listen.
We are hopeful that by the end of this week, we will have an agreement that will bring us into a 60-day ceasefire. 10 live hostages will be released. 9 deceased will be released. We're meeting at the president's direction with all the hostage families to let them know. And we think that this will lead to a lasting peace in Gaza.
Ambassador, this sounds awfully familiar. We're back to the idea of a 60-day ceasefire, something that Joe Biden, I believe, announced twice and never actually had parties on board, or Benjamin Netanyahu changed his tune. Do you expect to see this again?
Well, look, I mean, I couldn't wish more than anyone, or I do wish as much as Steve Witkoff does, to see this next stage achieved. The problem is, as you say, we have been at the same juncture point repeatedly, and the fundamental issue of how the war ends and what is to follow as far as arrangements for Gaza, security, governance, reconstruction arrangements for the people of Gaza is still very much unresolved.
Ambassador, I want to return to what you were talking about a moment ago, this idea of leverage that President Trump may or may not be willing to exercise to get what he wants from Israel here. What does that leverage actually look like? And does exercising it actually potentially jeopardize Israel's own security?
No, look, no American president, including this one, is going to want to step into a situation where they jeopardize the security of a close partner like Israel. I will say, though, some of the things which hung over the Biden administration and over President Biden, which were the issues of deterrence and how to best maintain publicly a seamless sort of unity of purpose, was very tested by the environment, because you had constant attacks on Israel from Iran, from all of the proxy network. That proxy network is not destroyed, but it is in shambles. Iran itself is very battered. So it gives President Trump a different playing field. And also, frankly, I think he knows how to apply pretty brutish pressure when he wants to. He's made it very clear he wants not just this next phase of 10 hostages released and 9 bodies with them. He wants everyone home, and he wants, most importantly, the end of the conflict. But that is a very big task indeed. And until now, we've not seen Prime Minister Netanyahu willing to articulate or to step forward on some of the political compromises he would be asked to make to get that end of the conflict.
I want to ask you about what's going on in Ukraine by way of U.S. policy ambassador. The president today was asked about a reversal in policy to begin providing weapons once again, defensive weapons in this case, to Ukraine. And the president spoke about this at a dinner that was actually held last evening with the aforementioned Benjamin Netanyahu, promising to send more weapons after we heard there were no weapons to send. Listen.
We're going to send some more weapons. We have to. They have to be able to defend themselves. They're getting hit very hard now. They're getting hit very hard. We're going to have to send more weapons. Yeah, defensive weapons primarily, but they're getting hit very, very hard.
There are questions about whether the president actually signed off on the initial decision to stop weapons. Now that they're flowing again, apparently, what does this mean for the relationship between the White House and the Pentagon? The future of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who put a stop to this just days ago.
Well, yes, you're right. And I think this is the second time that we've seen such an abrupt suspension of really critical defense articles, including things that have already been promised and bought and paid for, as it were, by and with the intention of conveying them to Ukraine. It's hard to say, and the president was very careful to say he didn't have any idea how this came about, this suspension. I think the important thing at this point is that he is directing those defense articles to be resumed. They are critical for the fight. The Ukrainians are fighting valiantly. And the president had a taste of the obduracy of Vladimir Putin just a couple of days ago on their phone call. So I think that probably further animated him to lean into this decision, and I, for one, welcome it.
Yeah, it's great to have you back with us, Barbara Lee, former Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs in the Biden administration. We thank you for your insights. Coming up on Balance of Power, we'll bring you the latest details on the search and rescue efforts for those deadly Texas floods. But first, lawmakers facing some big looming deadlines here, including passing the White House's Rescissions package. We're going to talk about that and the impact of tariffs with Democratic Congresswoman Haley Stevens of Michigan. She's got a front row to this story coming up next. Also a candidate for U.S. Senate, and a conversation you'll want to hear on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Well, you know, it really is something I'm passionate about, is trying to attract women to the industry. We see movies like Wolf of Wall Street, you know, and Greed is Good, and that's just not really very attractive to women. And also young people today. They want purposeful careers. They want to know that they're making a difference. And in my view, investment management and asset management are making a difference. We're the caretakers for people's retirement money, or the savings for their kids to go to college.
That was Ann Walsh, Chief Investment Officer at Guggenheim Investments, during this week's episode of Bullish with Sonali Bostick, talking about attracting more women into the finance industry. Tonight's episode features women of Wall Street and showcases how they broke through the male-dominated industry.
You can catch this episode of Bullish with Sonali Bostick tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg Television, or stream it 8 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg Originals. Now to some of the other stories that we're following in tonight's Power Brief on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. First, Minnesota State Senator John Hoffman, who was shot in his home 9 times last month, has been released from the hospital and is now recovering in a transitional care unit. Hoffman's wife, Yvette, was also shot during the attempted assassination and released from the hospital several days after the attack. The same suspected gunman is accused of killing Minnesota House Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband, Mark, who were laid to rest on June 29th.
HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is facing a lawsuit from pediatricians and public health experts over his abrupt changes to government vaccine recommendations. The changes include no longer recommending the COVID vaccine for healthy children and pregnant women. The suit alleges the agency violated the authority set up by Congress for vaccine recommendations after Kennedy bypassed an outside panel of advisors and handpicked their replacements. HHS did not respond to a request for comment by Bloomberg.
The U.S. Supreme Court has lifted a federal judge's pause on the Trump administration's widespread efforts to downsize the federal government. In the unsigned ruling, the court says the administration was likely to succeed in arguing President Trump's executive order was lawful, but did not take a position on whether agency plans to implement the order would pass legal muster. It's the second Supreme Court ruling to back President Trump's mass firing efforts.
And Republicans may have met their self-imposed deadline to pass President Trump's tax bill, but the clock is quickly ticking toward another key date, to pass a rescissions package that would reclaim $9.4 billion in spending that Congress already okayed. That deadline to approve those clawbacks is just 10 days away, and some Republicans have already voiced opposition to slashing funding for things like public broadcasting and HIV/AIDS prevention. On top of that, Congress must also pass appropriations bills for the fiscal year that ends in less than 3 months, or risk a government shutdown.
Joining us now on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio is Democratic Congresswoman Haley Stevens of Michigan, who is live on Capitol Hill. Even though many lawmakers have left town, Congresswoman, it's great to see you still here in the Capitol. We want to talk about trade to start off with you. The president made a lot of news today on tariffs with a moving deadline here. We're now looking at August 1st. But I want to go back to yesterday when the president announced new tariff levels on Japan and South Korea, 25%. You're looking at this, of course, through the prism of the auto manufacturing hub of Michigan. Is this actually good news for Detroit?
I'm actually just waiting for the deal for Michigan. 55 tariff announcements in the first 100 days of this administration. Chaos, erraticness, a lot of hiring on hold right now, a lot of costs continuing to go up. And in fact, whether you work in manufacturing or not, in Michigan, the thing I'm hearing over and over again is why are the costs continuing to rise? And that's what Mr. Trump's agenda is doing. It's putting pressure on Michigan consumers and American consumers. And this is no way to do economic policy in the United States of America. It is not working. And it's frankly one of the reasons why I felt very compelled to introduce legislation to lessen our dependence on China in the critical mineral space. Today, I announced that in a couple of days, I'll be rolling out the Unearth America's Future Act.
Well, Congresswoman, as we consider the tariff policy, are you heartened by the fact that the goalposts seem to keep moving, that what was supposed to be a July 9th deadline for trade deals with our various partners is now an August 1st deadline after we saw the initial extension from the tariffs announced back in April? Do you actually believe that the entirety of the president's policies that he's talked about will ultimately take effect?
No, I don't. And in fact, this is just self-imposed deadlines when we could be doing proven industrial policy. The reason why I just mentioned the legislation that I'm really excited about, that I've been working on for over a year, is because it was based off of what we did with the CHIPS and Science Act, which passed in 2022. I helped pass it, I helped draft it. And now what I'm doing is I'm taking tax incentives, grant dollars, R&D, and putting that into critical rare earth minerals and saying we're going to have domestic production here in the United States of America. We're going to have it here in Michigan. We're not going to be relying on China. And the reason I am sharing that is because that is proven industrial policy that works for jobs, for growth. I've got unions on board with this legislation, as well as environmental groups. That's the way to do things, not erratic tariffs that change by the minute. These are complex supply chains that really need certainty, not changes, not different days. Every day is tariff day in the Trump administration. Give me a break. It is not working, and it is one of the reasons why I'm speaking out, but alongside all the people I'm so proud to represent in Michigan, because they too are sick and tired of the cost rising.
Well, shouldn't Congress have a say in some of this, Congresswoman? When are we going to hear about legislation that attempts to address these tariffs, either from a Democrat or a Republican, that might actually get some critical mass here on Capitol Hill? Or has the Republican majority given up on checking this president?
Well, one of the things that we've seen the entire time Donald Trump has been president are these constant abuses of power. And yes, many members of Congress are asking why we are having tariff policy run through one branch of government. We've got co-equal branches of government. And again, I'm looking at everything through the lens of Michigan. Okay, we're hearing about all these different deals with all these different countries and all these different manufacturing enterprises. Where is the deal for Michigan? My state in certain counties is seeing upticks in unemployment, and that is because hiring is being frozen. Projects are being stalled. We just saw a big tax bill get passed that's only going to rise costs, certainly on healthcare, but it's also going to take whacks to our manufacturing sector at a time when we shouldn't really be affording it. We should be doing proven industrial policy, strategic partnerships, strategic investments that grow industries here and alongside our trade partners.
Well, as we consider what role Congress will have in that effort, Congresswoman, I also want to ask you about congressional appropriations that have already been made in the effort to claw them back through a rescissions package. We spoke earlier today with Mick Mulvaney, the former acting White House chief of staff during the first Trump administration, and this is what he told us about the likelihood of it actually passing in the Senate. Take a listen.
Is there any other legislation going to get passed? No, and especially if the rescissions package passes. Keep in mind, and I lose track of the days, I think the rescission package dies
July 18th.
Okay, yeah, 9 days. I had 10 days in my head or something, whatever it is. So look, Washington is always better at doing nothing than doing something. And if the Senate can sit on their hands for the next 10 days and say, oh, well, we just ran out of time on rescissions, I just don't see them doing it because of the dynamics within that building.
And the dynamics he was referring to, Congresswoman, were essentially that you might not be able to get Democrats to cooperate in a bipartisan way on spending bills that need to happen on appropriations if you're just going to turn around and potentially rescind that funding. What is the thinking within the Democratic caucus on that issue right now?
Well, look, I didn't vote for that legislation, and partly because it is more chaos and disruption when we really need certainty. And Michiganders know that we pay our fair share of taxpayer dollars, and we need those taxpayer dollars to come back to us. And this is really an important point when we're looking at the way in which the Trump administration has been illegally impounding funds, causing all sorts of chaos. It's coming down at the local level. Municipalities are being hurt as well. And then that's coming back to the Michigan taxpayer. So I am glad to hear Mr. Mulvaney say that he doesn't feel optimistic about this legislation going forward. Maybe we can work on real things like real legislation to lessen our dependence on China and bolster Michigan manufacturing.
Congresswoman, I have to ask you about your run for Senate while you're with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. There's reporting about a pollster in your neck of the woods in Michigan, Jill Dormington, writing that you and your Democratic rival, State Senator Mallory McMorrow, are good general election candidates, but you carry the burden, a unique vulnerability, as she put it, in your congressional voting record supporting Joe Biden. How do you answer that criticism?
Well, you mean like getting the CHIPS and Science Act done or the infrastructure bill that went to cleaning up lead pipes in Flint? Look, poll after poll has shown, and even that poll by Mr. Norrington, that I am the best Democrat to win in November. And her poll showed what all the other polls show, that I'm the only Democrat beating the Republican next fall. My sleeves are rolled up to meet Michiganders where they're at, to show how I fight for Michigan, how I win for Michigan, which is what I've done my entire career. I was chief of staff on President Obama's U.S. auto rescue that saved General Motors and Chrysler and 200,000 Michigan jobs. And I was just named Michigan's most effective Democratic lawmaker. I get things done for our state, and I'm thrilled to be putting up my hand to serve as our champion in the United States Senate.
All right, Democratic Congresswoman Haley Stevens of Michigan, thank you for joining us. Of course, also senatorial candidate for that state. And joining us now for more on what we just heard from the Congresswoman, including her comments on the president's trade policy, is this evening's political panel. Matt Gorman, executive vice president at Targeted Victory and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic strategist Caitlin Legacki, former senior advisor to Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo during the Biden administration. Welcome to you both. Matt, we just heard a lot from the Congresswoman there about how, if this really is ultimately about supporting American manufacturing, the president's policies are not being effective in doing so. Take that as you will. But when we consider the decisions companies have to make around whether or not they are going to bring more into the United States, don't they need to know that tariffs are actually going to stick or be enacted in the first place? And instead, the president keeps punting the football.
Yeah, stepping back real quick also, what it also tells me is that her campaign needs some donors pretty badly. There were underwhelming fundraising numbers appearing on Bloomberg. She knows what she's doing, and also the differential between her and Mallory McMorrow, the state senator, talking about what she's done in Congress. It was a very subtle differentiation there. But I took note of the fact she's doing it, and doing it from D.C. more than anything else. But number two, you're right. This has been the song of the Trump administration so far, pushing these things. As I understand it, I think they've gotten close on a couple countries, if not a handful of countries, and they've trying to use this as leverage, of people dragging their feet at the last minute. I'm curious where the EU ends up if they send a letter to the EU. But you're right. I mean, we've been through this before, so obviously the markets in some ways have already baked this in. I'm curious to see what happens as we get close to the August 1st deadline.
Well, as the Democrat on our panel, I'd be curious not only to hear your thoughts on the trade news today, but the way that Haley Stevens framed this as a candidate for U.S. Senate. Is that going to be the Democratic message across the country?
Pretty much. I mean, what we saw after COVID was auto prices increasing and accounting for up to a third of inflation because we didn't have the chips and the supply chain materials that we needed to keep our facilities operating and manufacturing goods. And so, you know, in Michigan especially, they understand the importance of having clear trade policy, having clear supply chain policy, so that we can keep our factories open. Because it was literally in Michigan where, like, Ford was having to put workers on a small break because they didn't have parts in the office or in the factory. So it's a very real issue in Michigan in a way that it might be a little bit less tangible in other areas. But I think that Stevens is highlighting the CHIPS Act and supply chains because she knows that it affects costs, but it also affects jobs in Michigan.
Well, of course, the administration is pushing a narrative that you're not seeing costs affected just yet in terms of the impact tariffs are having on inflation, but it's also worth pointing out that a lot of tariffs haven't actually been implemented yet, just threatened. And more tariffs are threatened now for August 1st, a deadline that President Trump said was always the deadline, even though, as of yesterday, that was not our understanding. This is how he framed it in the cabinet meeting earlier.
It's always been August 1st. That's when we're paying. A statement was put out today, and I put it out just to make it clear. It wasn't a change. It was August 1st. We don't change very much. You know, every time we put out a statement, they say he made a change. I didn't make a change. A clarification, maybe. No, August 1st they pay.
A clarification, maybe, Caitlin, but he literally had to sign an executive order to change the date from tomorrow, July 9th, to August 1st. Is this just a president who doesn't want the taco label thrown up again?
I don't look. Whether that is his rationale, it's clear that he's never willing to kick the can down the road, or he's never afraid to kick the can down the road, whether it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 months. But, you know, we hear a lot about how government should be run more like a business. And it's very clear that any business that had complicated supply chains that tried to operate like this would go under in a heartbeat. And frankly, we're in a position where either governments are going to stop wanting to deal with the U.S. and they're going to look for trading partners elsewhere, or businesses are going to stop taking this seriously, and then they are going to get blindsided when the tariffs eventually hit. neither of them is a good situation for us.
It does seem a bit like gaslighting to tell us that it was always August 1st when the entire world was planning for July 9th. But I digress. A lot was said in the cabinet meeting today, specific to the idea of cutting deals, sending these tariff letters. Is there a difference? The president seems not to think so. Listen.
The letters I send out are, we have made some deals. We can make a lot more deals. It's just too time consuming. It just makes it more complicated. And we can do things over the years too. You know, we're not hard line. But it's about time the United States of America started collecting money from countries that were ripping us off and laughing behind our back at how stupid we were.
It's too time-consuming, Matt. What about 90 deals in 90 days?
Yeah. No, look, it's a bit of a change of a tune there, but I think you're going back into the story in many ways of this Trump term is the fact that he feels preeminently confident in his abilities to get people in a room and try and get a deal done. And I think all of this is trying to create leverage for the U.S. and some sort of deal like they did with the U.K. and being able to sell it to the American public. I think he feels eminently confident that if whatever he gets out of the room in terms of a deal, he can sell as a win. It's just a matter of getting that. And I think in some ways, as I said before, a lot of these trading partners, as I understand, were dragging their feet a little bit. They were getting close to the deadline. They saw folks how other things went in China and otherwise, and they were not being as receptive as he wanted them to be. And so this is just the stick, if you will, and the carrot and the stick.
Well, and it's not just trade deals we're considering here either. He right now is meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House for a second night in a row, trying to get a deal to end the war in Gaza. He expressed today dissatisfaction with Russian President Vladimir Putin. He wants to get to a ceasefire in Ukraine. None of these things, though, have happened yet. How much more patience do you think the president has for this?
I mean, I think what you're seeing is an evolution of his tone, certainly on Vladimir Putin. And I think you even saw this again with the shipments in Ukraine. He's willing to have this push and pull and hold things up or push things through depending on how the interpersonal relationships of others kind of go. And he feels like he has some leverage with Putin and push the weapons through to Ukraine, which obviously made Zelensky very happy. I think we're waiting to see again how it shapes up in Gaza. But yeah, I think he's doing this on multiple fronts, not just on the tariff front.
So did Vladimir Putin lose his friend Donald Trump today?
He might have. I mean, one of the things that I will say about Donald Trump is that he is a heat-seeking missile for getting to yes on a lot of these deals, whereas a lot of Democrats are frequently looking for reasons to say no. And so, I would prefer for Donald Trump to align with Ukraine than Russia, but he's fickle, and he's willing to constantly work with the person that's going to help him get to yes soonest. Some may call that unprincipled, some may call that pragmatic, but I think he is really focused on finding a way to wrap this up. And I hope that when it's all said and done, that we find ourselves on the side of Ukraine.
Well, so when we consider, Matt, everything he still wants to do, knowing he's fresh off this win with the One Big Beautiful Bill actually passing, that was not necessarily easy. But could we come to learn that was actually the easiest thing for him ultimately to accomplish in the second term? Everything else gets harder from here.
I mean, look, he certainly has a pull with our party, especially in Congress. He doesn't have with Vladimir Putin or Zelensky or Hamas, if you will. He certainly, when it comes to legislative and politicking, he has a preeminent power and a pull. And so that's why I'm very bullish on getting some form of rescissions done, some form of reconciliation done as a way to have forward motion and to put these things, which he wants in executive orders, make them far more stickier once they're in law, as we see it over and over again with what presidents pass and codifying the law.
Great conversation, and thanks to both Matt Gorman and Kate Little-Agaki. A great panel for us today on Balance of Power. Coming up, Texas Governor Greg Abbott providing an update on the search and rescue efforts following those deadly Texas floods. Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine will share the latest next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Just in the Kerr County area alone, there are 161 people who are known to be missing. And again, that comes from combined law enforcement efforts, 161 known people who are missing. Know this, We will not stop until every missing person is accounted for.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott earlier today providing a status update on search and rescue efforts following the deadly floods in Texas, as the number of those missing and killed is expected to rise. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lyons. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we now turn live from Dallas to our Texas Bureau Chief, Julie Fine, for the latest on this. Julie, it's good to have you despite the story that we're discussing here. Despite the tragedy here and some of these numbers that we're seeing are staggering, it does appear that we are bracing for even worse news. What can you tell us?
Yeah, I mean, today, Governor Abbott, when he came out and said at 161 were missing in Kerr County alone, I think that really brought the magnitude home. I mean, we've heard of people missing, but a lot of those people were in campgrounds or they were at Camp Mystic, so they were accounted for. Then there were just the people traveling there. So these numbers are going to come out. It's going to likely get worse, which puts more pressure on local, state, and government officials to explain how this possibly could have happened. It's just a very difficult time, but now it's the time for questions to be answered. I mean, Joe, you've seen some of these news conferences. Up until today, they've been pretty much very routine, but today was the first time the local officials were really getting the tough questions about how could this happen and what's going to happen next.
Well, and from local officials to federal officials, President Trump today, Julie, during his cabinet meeting, confirmed that he will be visiting Texas on Friday. This is what he said.
I'll be going down on Friday with First Lady. We'll be taking a trip, and we don't want to get in anyone's way because, that's what happens. The president goes and everyone's around focused on, I don't want anyone to focus on us.
Julie, is there an expectation that the search and rescue effort will be fully completed by the time Air Force One touches down?
There's likely no way. I mean, you heard the governor say today, we will be here until it's over. This town is decimated and the areas around it. I mean, some of the streets are not passable. Possibility of some more rain. This will not be cleaned up for a long time. But on top of that, you've lost roads, you've lost bridges. And in the process of that, they are still searching for people. So to think that this will completely be done by Friday, it's just not. I just don't see how that could happen.
Julie, just quickly, we only have 30 seconds left, but you mentioned the potential of more rain. Just what kind of weather are you bracing for?
It's nothing like what we saw this past weekend, but there's been a little bit of rain on and off. But again, nothing like we have seen the past weekend. So first responders are able to continue their work. But like we just said, it's going to take them some time to make their way through this.
All right. Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine covering a very difficult and ongoing story for us. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And of course, that is one story we'll continue to follow for you here on Bloomberg. And you can find coverage of that and more in the Washington Edition newsletter, on the terminal, and online.
We'll meet you back here tomorrow. Thank you for joining us, as always, on Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.